Welcome back. Now before I get onto the wheels, I need to sort out that right fork leg. I picked up a tube clamp so I could hold it in the vise by the tube rather than the axle clamp on the fork bottom. Now for everyone at home who screams at the screen saying, "Tom, why do you not have a bigger vise?" I know, okay? I know. In the meantime, I called up my buddy Paul. With more heat, a much bigger vise, and a metric shit ton more leverage, we finally got it spinning. So now I can blast it, paint it, fit the new stanchion, fit the damper rod and the new seals and bushes, close it all up and fit it back into the yokes. Now, let's go back in time to last summer and get started on those wheels. I started with the rear wheel, giving the sprocket nuts a soak in penetrant, then span them off. I'll be replacing these as well as fitting a new sprocket. I flipped it over and did the same on the brake disc side. I peeled out the dust seal, which had clearly started to let crap past it. Then I removed the circlip that retains the wheel bearing on this side. Then I drove out the bearing with a few taps on each side to push it out evenly. I lifted the wheel off to reveal the bearing and spacer. It's always nice to see that the bearings you're replacing really are knackered, as this one was practically falling apart. Then I flipped it over and drove the other side out with a large socket on an extension. Then I put the circlip, the spacer and the cush drive rubbers all in the container ready for cleaning up. Then I moved to the front wheel, flicking the dust seal out, removing the disc bolts and removing the discs. Then taking out the circlip that holds the speedo drive flange in place. I couldn't quite get a purchase on the lip of the bearing, so I got my blind puller set out and pulled it out instead, which actually worked pretty well. I dropped out the spacer, then drove out the other side. I packed away the hardware and rallied the troops to help with cleaning the grime off.
What about here?
Yeah, anywhere that's dirty.
Well, that's the wheels cleaned up, so now I can get a proper look at them. The paint's far from perfect and it's peeling away in some places. They'll definitely need fresh paint or powder coat, so I cleaned up the corroded areas and took them in for blasting. While they're out, I can have a look at the brake discs. They're all quite dirty, and the carriers on the front have had a coat of gold at some point, which is starting to fail. You can see the original black colour on the backs. I gave them a clean up to get a better idea of the condition. Despite the flaking paint job, the discs themselves had plenty of life left in them, though they could definitely do with a refresh. Luckily, I know a guy who offers a great rebuild service complete with fresh bobbins and cerakoting of the carriers. So I'll get them packed up and sent off to Stopping Power UK to work their magic. Next, I made a start on the sprocket carrier, removing the old nuts and dust seal. Then I removed the circlip and drove out the bearing. I cleaned it all up in the parts washer, and even though the circlip was quite corroded, the carrier itself actually came out really well. I laid them out on the bench with a new circlip and the spacer. Next I need to clean up all the other parts from the rear wheel, starting with the cush drive rubbers. The spacers and disc bolts cleaned up really nice. Though the same can't be said for the circlip, and it's the same for the front, so I'll be replacing those. The speedo drive will get a tidy up, and I'll zinc plate the other front wheel spacer and axle nut so they're protected against the elements. I got started with the speedo drive, removing the dust seal to see what it was like inside. It actually done a pretty good job, as it was quite clean, but I figured it was worth giving it a thorough clean and fresh grease. And with a fresh coat of silver paint on the casing, I put it back together with fresh grease and a new dust seal. I'd zinc plated these bits back when I was working on the swing arm hardware, but jumping back to the rear axle, this stuff needed a decent clean-up. First step was a run through the parts washer, which did the trick on some of the parts. But the paint was failing on the brake caliper bracket, so I stripped the old paint, blasted it, cleaned it, mixed up some paint in this cool drill-mounted paint mixer I got. And after the silver, I applied a coat of matte clear to protect it. I also blasted the axle nut and used a blackening solution to replicate the original finish, which actually came out really nicely. Then I got the call from the powder coaters to say the wheels were ready, and here they are. The guys at Curdford Shop Blasting did a great job in replicating the cosmic grey colour, and I much prefer the darker wheels compared to the green. So let's get the new bearings in and get them back on the bike. Obviously I'd been a numpty and thrown the old bearing away when I took it apart, so I couldn't use that as a drift, but luckily the right size impact socket did the trick. I flipped it over and dropped in the spacer, making sure to line it up as best I could. I'd had the new bearings in the freezer for a few hours to help them drop in easier. A quick check to make sure the spacer was still aligned and the bearing was up against it, and I put it back on the bench and fit the speedo drive flange and its circlip. With the other side fitted, I could fit the dust seal on this side, as well as the freshly zinc-plated spacer. Onto the rear wheel, it was the same story. Bearing in one side, flip the wheel, drop the spacer in, and drive in the second bearing. Then I fit the new bearing into the sprocket carrier. There, that should be good for a fair few miles now. I refit the cush drive rubbers. After cleaning up, I'd had a good look at them, and they're still in good condition. I fit the spacer into the sprocket carrier and married it back up with a wheel. And then fitted the dust seal. To complete the left side of the wheel, a brand new JT sprocket with new spring nuts. With them all torqued up, I flipped it over and fit the circlip and dust seal so it's all ready for the brake disc. Talking of brake discs, they're back, so I got started with the fronts. With new bobbins and the carriers Cerakoted back to the original black colour, they've done a great job. I really recommend Stop and Power UK for this kind of work. I'd like to give them a little spin to check the mating surface has no raised bits or grit in there. I put a drop of thread lock on the disc bolts and tightened them up in a crisscross pattern. Then it was the same story for the other side. Swapping to the rear, the disc had been given a similar coat of black Cerakote in the middle of the disc. I dug out the disc bolts and fitted them with a bit of thread lock, just like the fronts. So that's the wheels themselves done. It's time to get them back on the bike. I laid out all the components for the rear axle and spread a small amount of grease to the areas on the swing arm, paying attention to the rail the brake caliper arm will slide on. The bracket went on first, held in place by the axle, then I offered up the wheel. I had it propped on some wood so I could lower the frame until it was at the right height, and then slid the axle all the way through. I'll put the R-clip back in once it's torqued up, but first, a quick spin test. Time for the front. God, I do love reassembling clean parts. I lined up the speedo drive with the flange and the wheel, and rolled it into the forks, making sure the notch in the speedo drive went into the slot on the left fork bottom. I slid the front axle through the forks and wheel, and span on the cap. A few days later though, the sun was out, and I was tempted to make the most of it. Spurred on by the spring sunshine, I fitted new stainless pinch bolts to the forks, tightening up the left-hand side first, but leaving the right side loose so I could tighten up the axle all the way. Then tightened up the right side pinch bolts. Right then, let's have a proper look at the rolling chassis. So, we've got the wheels blasted and powder coated cosmic grey, bearings in the steering head, cleaned up yokes and a full service on the forks, including new stanchions and painted fork bottoms. I upgraded to a modern rear shock with freshly zinc plated hardware and all new bearings on the linkage and swing arm, a new rear sprocket and fully restored brake discs. I've switched from that mirror polished finish on the frame and swing arm to a brush finish, which is much more to my taste. The subframe got silver powder coat and looked like brand new. I think it's time to sit down. There we go, the rolling chassis. That was always chapter 1, so next up I can really focus on that engine. I've already made a start on stripping down the cylinder head and inspecting the valves, so I'll be back soon with another episode. See you then.